I thought nutrition for a very long time was physiology and math, right? If I can do calories in, calories out, and I know how nutrient metabolism works, I can manipulate the body. Turns out there's a lot more to it. The behavioral component's very huge and largely influenced by our society.
Yeah, man. Thanks for meeting with me today. I know I've been wanting to do something like this for a while, so
Absolutely.
we'll definitely get to some more of the because I want to hear more and let you talk more about your perspective on nutrition as it relates to performance and an average nutrition and stuff.
Sure.
But the first, just to provide some context, you saw the questions, but the very first portion really is just like, how do we enhance performance? And like when you've worked with athletes, what did you do? Things like that. So we'll probably start off talking with that kind of stuff. And then it'll kind of be a little bit more free form after that. And we can just keep the discussion going. So
Cool. Sounds great.
yeah. Do you have any questions for me before we get started?
Not so much. I'm going to give a lot of prefacing.
Yes.
So just kind of give context behind my experience and let people know where I'm coming from.
Sure. Okay. Sounds good to me. All right. So we're just going to start off and just go right through the questions. So actually, before we go into the questions, can you just maybe introduce yourself and tell us about how long you've been doing nutrition and kind of some of your background working with athletes and stuff like that?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii. Sports is a big thing out there. So it was a big passion of mine to be involved in athletics in any capacity. So I did my undergrad in exercise science at Northern Arizona University. I did a year in exchange at the University of Oregon. I knew I wanted to be in athletics, but strength and conditioning was kind of waving its way out for me. So I decided to do intern class with the sports nutrition program at the University of Oregon. Their former director, who's now with the New York Giants, he gave me my first introduction to sports nutrition. And at the time, this was 2015, I believe. Sports nutrition was only been around for maybe 15, 20 years, but in a very small capacity. So schools like Nebraska, schools like Oregon, the SEC schools, they had the capacity and the financial privilege to have a sports dietitian, which I'll get into what a sports dietitian is. But having that capacity really showed me this is where the new wave might head. Strength and conditioning, as we both know, is a very saturated field, and you have to work extremely hard and be extremely lucky and to have the privilege to do it for a living, no doubt. So I have those privileges, and I have lots of privileges actually that I feel is important to acknowledge, just because to give people context that it's not just hard work that gets me to certain places, but I'm a male. I was supported through my education by my family and my career choice. I'm able-bodied. I have a lot of privileges in society that allow me to pursue this path and continue to. So I just want to make that known.
Sure.
And after I did my stint at Oregon, I went back to Northern Arizona, graduated with my bachelor's, and then I continued on to the University of Utah master's program in sports nutrition. They have one at Washington State. That's a little bit smaller program that's coordinated, I believe. I have a friend who goes there. But there in Utah are the only two programs on the West Coast. And that really allowed me to pursue both a master's degree and an RD credential, registered dietitian credential, at the same time. That was really eye-opening to see the transition between, undergraduate level work versus graduate, and start to work with people, because it's a different ball game from taking nutritional information specifically and trying to transform it into a way that's palatable for people. So from there, I worked with, as an intern, the athletic program at the University of Utah, their men's lacrosse team and their men's golf team for a year. I had graduated that summer, got my RD credential, and I took an opportunity to move out to the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, and work with their athletic program. So I worked with football, wrestling, a multitude of sports there for a brief time. That was a great experience. Showed me a lot of things that I'll talk about in the future in this interview, about differences between schools and differences in programs. Most of my experiences in the collegiate sector, so I'm going to speak to that primarily. If you'd like to extrapolate it to general community or even elite professional, I'm happy to elaborate on that if you think that's necessary. But just collegiate's kind of where I hung out for most of my career so far.
Okay.
And then I pursued an opportunity as a fellow at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I work with women's rowing, men's and women's swim and dive, and fencing. So 3 very unique sports, lots of different influential factors with their training program and the personality type. And that's in one of the questions that I'll get to. And that led me to here. So I had moved back to Utah now in search of work due to extraneous circumstances, but really excited to see where my unique background and skill set, because everybody's got their own way and their own path to getting to where they need to be. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Awesome. That's great, man. So one thing that I do have a question. I mean, just on your experience, is it common for people to be coming out of these programs to be as well decorated as you are? I mean, you have a lot of different experiences. You've worked with so many different people. You've had a couple of different mentors by now. And you've worked with, I mean, dozens, hundreds of athletes. So, I mean, is it common so early on in your career to have so much exposure to this? Or is it, have you just had some extra opportunities on top of the schooling?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a combination of a lot of things. My privilege is financially being able to take a lower salaried position, because most of the jobs in our field are part-time or interns or fellowships. So in conjunction with a grad assistant, and those are great opportunities, no doubt, but it is a limiting factor to who can pursue those things. It's one of my personal goals to try and make those more accessible to people. So you increase inclusion and diversity within our field, because if you work in disease prevention or general health, you're having a lot of diversity ethnically, from a physical able-bodied standpoint. So the more diversity we have, I think that contributes to it. And that personally, for me, pushed me to see other things, travel across the country. I also have my CSCS, something that, people said, oh, you might not use it because, you're a dietitian or you're a strength coach. And if you want to do both, you're wearing 2 hats at the same time, and it kind of convolutes the team portion of it. But for me, the CSCS and my understanding in exercise physiology and strength and conditioning, it just reinforces what I do know about sports nutrition. And it enables me to have conversations with people like you who are more versed than I am in training programs. So we can work together and speak the same language. And that's for me, like you mentioned earlier, wearing hats, having the knowledge to be able to sit at a table and have a conversation with different professionals of different perspectives. That's my big quest, is to try and learn as much as I can from different people, because the more people you can work with, the more opportunities you're going to have, the more you're going to learn.
Nice. Yeah, awesome. The cohesiveness is so important, especially with the way that everything is moving towards this interdisciplinary approach. The last interview that I performed with one of the strength and conditioning coaches that works at Eastern Washington University here, her name is Jody Tingman. She spoke a lot about the collaboration that's required to get all these athletes, both team and individual, working on the same page and getting the maximum amount of benefit out of the programs,
For sure.
from the whole health perspective. So that's definitely really cool. So okay, so with that introduction, let's go ahead and dive into some of these questions. So in nutrition, what are a few of the crucial training factors that you've observed in order to facilitate enhanced sport performance? So how do you enhance sport performance through nutrition?
Yeah, I think one of the first steps, and a lot of the work I like to do, I wouldn't ever describe it as super sexy or things you see in the newer emerging research. It's very fundamental. The athletes I get in, fresh out of high school, coming from various backgrounds, whether, supported by family from a nutrition standpoint for their entire lives, and now they have to worry about how, what, and when they're going to eat. That's a very fundamental thing. So I really focus a lot on 2 things when it comes to training factors, or what I would call just factors within nutrition that would facilitate the performance in general, because a lot of times I don't get the opportunity to work with one athlete at a time. I'm working with multiple teams, 500 plus athletes at certain universities, and I need to be able to disseminate information that translates across the board. So whether it's through social media, whether it's through a team talk, I have to be able to get information out quickly and concisely. So two things I really harp on, especially when we're trying to build the fundamental basis for athlete development. And you're going to hear me talk about athlete development in the long term. Most times we think about that in the, oh, let's build, stability, flexibility, then we'll build on power, plyometrics, et cetera, right? That's a very generic linear pathway. In nutrition, it doesn't exist, but I'm hoping to collaborate with others to create a nutrition hierarchy in which we can kind of evaluate, right? So evaluation is the biggest piece of what you're going to work on, what's most important. If we can't evaluate it, we don't really know what we're trying to work on. Okay? So evaluating where they are in a nutrition education standpoint, right? And most times it's not even, they don't know what foods are good and bad. I put those in quotations because it's arbitrary, but that's how people know food. Evaluating their relationship with food, evaluating what financial resources they have available, evaluating where they're from. I had athletes from other countries, so I could tell them to eat all these foods. I could tell them, hey, here's good foods, good for performance and increasing it. But until I evaluate who they are or what their group looks like, the information is not as relevant. Okay, so number one is evaluation. That's the key step before I even do anything, and it's not necessarily something I can plug in, but a step that happens before the rest. The second thing is periodization. Very common term, and everyone has their own method to that. But within nutrition, I'm periodizing my own information and my own stimuli. Okay, so an analogy or trying to make comparisons between strength conditioning and nutrition. As a strength and conditioning coach, you have the ability to impose a stimuli and use that as the beginning and end of what that individual does over the course of time, right? You have almost 100% control and manipulation of that.
Right.
Within nutrition, so much more variability, right? So I try to take that evaluation piece, see where they're at, and then see where we're going, and then tier where we're at as far as trying to improve their nutrition skills, their knowledge, their relationship with food, their body. All those things need to be planned out, just how you would coordinate a training program in a season, right? In college sports, we don't see athletes during the summer typically, but it frees up a lot of time for us to try and build skills for them, right? In competition season, we're kind of that background, just make sure everyone's fed food service role. And our role changes just like strength and conditioning throughout the season. So we need to make sure our education is appropriate to that. And the reason my kind of factors are very abstract right now is because sports nutrition is still developing.
Right.
Each school has different resources to what's available. So an example of an arbitrary number, some public schools might spend $30 million on a sports nutrition budget. Okay. And that's kind of on the higher end, where you have some smaller programs, right? Maybe a Division II program who has a dietitian, 5-6 million. Okay. And you're going to do vastly different things and have vastly different resources. If you're in the Olympics scale, it's limitless, right? So the information I'm giving you, it's not as applicable, but when you're working in different settings, we need to understand what variables we have available to us and what resources. So I'm sorry for kind of an abstract answer, but you have to redefine factors that are important based on the scenario you're in.
Okay. So maybe let's, I like that you're trying to draw the correlation between periodization of strength training and maybe periodization of nutrition. So like, let's say, so with that really generic strength training, you start off with your stability and balance phases, and then you move into, your maximal strength and all of that.
For sure.
What would you say is the best, like some of those building blocks that you would usually address, sort of regardless of the client? Like what's that stability information? How are you finding out how stable they are for nutrition? What are some of that criteria?
Yeah. Have you ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yes. Yeah. I love Maslow.
Very basic, and it's a framework in which to work out of. It's not absolute or linear, but your basic needs are food, water, shelter, right?
Right.
So analogous to that in a nutrition context, I need to make sure someone has access to food in a reliable sense, right? Collegiate athletes, I'm not sure what the research indicates as far as a number goes, but I'd argue in my experience and maybe your experience being in college, food insecurity is very prevalent, especially with increased needs as an athlete.
Can you define food insecurity?
So not having access to food on a regular basis that's sufficient to meet basic physiological needs.
Okay.
So that's like not knowing when your next meal is going to come, right? And some athletes struggle with that, especially if you're on scholarship. You might not have enough money left over for food. Right? So using that as the very basis, a priority that a lot of schools have taken is to feed their athletes, right? Mm-hmm. So we have snacks, we have fueling stations, we have catering that comes in to feed them. And I think that's a crucial step, because one thing that gets missed when athletes don't have food security is an increase in disordered eating behaviors. So binge eating, going long periods without food, really getting out of tune with what their body actually needs. And then you also add in their high load of school, high load of exercise. It's really a recipe for medical complications when you look at their energy deficit. So my priority always and always will be first and foremost getting enough food for athletes. And that can be such a tough thing.
Right.
And I'll touch on, I think one of your next questions talks about like differences in athletes, sport athletes. So I'll talk about those variables.
Yeah. So let's just dive right into it then. The, really the crux of the question is how do those considerations vary for the type of athlete that we're looking at? So, I mean, we have football athletes who are highly skilled and highly anaerobic, but also there's a massive aerobic component to their fitness. Mm-hmm. And then you go to other sports, which may be like cross country, which may be almost purely aerobic. How do you address some of those concerns from the stability all the way up to the max performance level?
Yeah. So I think when you look at it from a very physiological standpoint, you're just looking at two different energy systems and what substrates fuel those systems. Simply, you'll need to provide enough substrate in the form of energy availability to make sure that athlete has substantial fuel to do their training and recover from the training stimulus itself. Okay, so an example would be carbohydrates. It's very popularized for athletes to start to trend to a low carbohydrate diet, especially when you have aesthetic sports or power sports, when power to weight ratio might be important or have an implication. When you take carbohydrates and start to remove it from an athlete's training diet, power, speed, agility, cognitive ability all go down. So an important nutrient there. When you start to move into longer duration sports, an example would be rowing or maybe middle distance running. Carbohydrates starts to become a less of a primary substrate, but starting to teeter into the glycolytic pathways when we start to get into certain percentages of VO2 max. And we can get very detailed with this, and you see this a lot in cycling. That's a sport that's very numbers focused, right? And they do a great job at it. Also, like prefacing that these athletes have lots of support, so they can and have the means to do so. When you start to get into long distance, you see different substrate utilization, more fat oxidative, right? So just trying to fuel for the work that's necessary. That's something that I try to preach to the athletes. Granted, they have food security. Granted, they have access to food and those types of things. I just want to make sure they have enough type of gas they need, right, to make sure they're performing well and recovering well. And sometimes, and most times, it's more than they think they're eating.
So would you say that you've encountered athletes more often under eating or more often overeating?
Yeah, so it's under fueling, 100%. And that's a lot of factors. So an example of a collegiate athlete schedule, practice 6 a.m., 6:30, maybe didn't eat before. Maybe their gut gets really disturbed early in the morning if they eat. So we didn't eat, practice till 7:30. I got class at 8. They run to class till maybe 10:30. Maybe they eat lunch. Maybe they have a test at noon. So they study all the way to noon. Finally get around to eating at the dining hall, maybe around 1:32. Practice in the evening. maybe didn't eat before that. And now we have created such a large deficit that they're going to backload all the energy needs that they had at the back of the day. And while they might meet their actual caloric need, and I say might because in an example of a football player, you're looking 5,000-6,000 plus calories, and it's just an arbitrary number. But to eat that much in a meal, you're asking a lot from them. And that builds on disordered eating behaviors such as binge eating.
Right.
So being able to spread it out and have them to eat on the go and have them grocery shop for themselves sometime in the 7 days in a week, that's an indirect method of food restriction or food inavailability, right? They're not purposefully under eating. It's a consequence of the schedule.
Due to their schedule. Okay.
Exactly.
All
and we
right.
see that very commonly in collegiate athletes. They just don't have the resources as readily available as we'd like.
Okay. So how did your program, in your experience, how did you guys address working with athletes who were under eating as a result of their schedule?
Yeah, so in these big conferences like the Pac-12 SEC that I've been in, we have a budget, fortunately enough, a budget given to us by athletic administration to really support the needs of our athletes, to give them full access to food, whether that's protein shakes that have higher calories because, we're trying to condense the volume into smaller amounts. Calcium-rich foods, we start to let the research dictate what types of foods and snacks we want to purchase, so that we make sure they're getting adequate nutrients of specific concern to athletes. So calcium, iron, vitamin D. Those are kind of the three popular ones in research. Omega-3s kind of getting up there.
Yeah.
But we try to make those foods widely available because the odds are they're going to get those in their own grocery purchases are less likely.
Right.
So we just make food available. So there's fueling stations that I've seen schools have all day, or maybe from 8 to noon. Some schools have training tables, which means they'll come in for a meal at lunch, or they'll come in for a meal at dinner, and they can eat food there. And the NCAA deregulated feeding. I'm not sure if you were aware of that. I think back in 2000, might have been 2012, 2013. I'm not quite sure what the year is, but that enabled us as dietitians to be able to feed athletes, not just snacks, but meals. And that was a big, crucial thing that we saw from that point to now. The health of our athletes have improved significantly since then.
Okay. Because you're actually able to educate them on full meals. Not
we
just
can feed them.
Yeah.
Bottom line, we can feed them food, and that's huge.
So how, this is a little bit off topic, but on the sort of to the point of you feeding them, but with the considerations of maybe an athlete who has experienced food insecurity for the first 18, 19 years of their life, and then you're able to feed them. Does there become some dependence, or how do you approach it in such a way that, like, we're going to be giving you all this, but after you leave school and you're not an athlete anymore, you will have to do this yourself? How do you approach that, like that sort of ending stage when they are about to be done being an athlete, or at least maybe moving on to being a professional athlete, and they got to do it themselves?
Mm-hmm. And that's the trickiest part about, I think, this job, is that you want to balance the performance piece, because that's what this whole discussion's centered on, is trying to improve performance, and then also building them a set of skills and knowledge bases to succeed in life after. We all know how rare it is for athletes to continue on to the next level. Although that almost every athlete I've ever encountered believes they can, and I'm super happy for them and encourage them to pursue that dream while they're here at the 4 years at the university. We still have to consider this part, the what's next, and how do I treat food? How do I treat exercise? What do I think about myself outside of being an athlete? Who am I? As dietitians, a lot of our time is focused on the performance. And that's because as far as the administration and the coaches, this is what they're looking for. And we're so new as a career and profession that I think, to get a seat at that table, to push an agenda that's a little different than what they're interested in, we have to compromise and meet in the middle. And you won't meet a professional who works in the background, so not a coach or not a GM or owner, who works in the background, who doesn't have to work together and meet in the middle with someone else.
Right.
So contrasting ideas about health and performance as it is defined in collegiate sports. But you'll find different people doing it at a higher success rate or lower success rate, and kind of a gray answer to that question, but it's highly variable depending on the culture of the school you're at.
Okay. So maybe that kind of leads me into the next question. So if we're looking for that higher success rate, both of performance and of just overall general health, what are the factors outside of training that are most important for optimizing athletic performance and just getting that higher success rate for our students?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the collaboration piece. That's where we're headed, right? Interdisciplinary, that's where we're headed. I think it's challenging though when we don't really understand what each other does. Sometimes I've been in meetings where we meet together, we kind of each go with what we know about our athletes, and then the coach decides on what's best. And that model works in some cases. But I think allowing different roles to take prominence based on our athletes. So I've had the privilege to work with a lot of sports psychologists. Sports psychologists are a new addition to a performance team in the collegiate setting. Very valuable, but there's only so many. So I've seen as many as 2.5 psychologists for 500 athletes. So a tremendous amount of load.
Very swamped, yeah.
For those professionals. And I think when we try to balance performance with health, right, we have to be able to define both of these things as a group. So if you and I have very different definitions of what health means or looks like or sounds like or behaves like, we're not aiming towards the same goal. Okay. So kind of a societal example is how we define health. For athletes, part of it's the way you look, and a large portion of it's the way you look is defining of your health, right? A lot of it is in a binary. One example I like to make, and I'm a big advocate for mental health, is there's this idea that mental health is the absence of mental illness, when in reality exists in a spectrum, right? You can have deteriorating mental health, but not have a mental illness. And you've seen a lot of elite athletes speak out about their mental illness or their poor mental health as a professional athlete with anxiety and depression. You see it in college students and athletes these days. So there's another component to add into what we define as health, right? So nutrition, exercise, mental health. We have a long list of other things that we can add on to that. When we start to bring that into the discussion, we start to realize, wow, our team for performance and health is actually getting a lot bigger. It's not just coach, strength and conditioning, nutrition, psychology. It's all these other professionals that can really support our university, our athletes, our students. And it's just finding those resources and being able to commit to those.
Okay. So the general collaboration and everyone being on the same page for a given athlete's performance is kind of what you're saying. So I 100% agree with that. It's especially with the team-based performance, because when you have a coach and more on an individual basis, like let's say Olympic lifting, they usually are smaller teams. A coach might have 5 or 6 athletes, so they can get to know their athletes really well. Versus on a larger team, they're having to rely on other people telling the coach, or the coach has to rely on other people saying like, hey, here's the psychology of the student. And then we have like, there's also the nutritional considerations and things like that. So it's super important to collaborate. Okay. Thanks for talking about that. So on that same note, what are some of the most important lessons that you have learned in your roles with working as an athlete and helping them enhance their performance?
Yeah. So part of the reason I stuck around in the collegiate realm for so long, people might ask like, why don't you try and work with an NFL team or work with elite athletes? Because it is perceived as the pinnacle, of our careers, is to work with people who are gold medalists and have lots of notoriety. I think the reason why I stick around in sports nutrition and developing adults, I think they show a lot of promise to be curious, to learn, to identify themselves, to help other people. Um, that's a huge reason why I stuck around, and they've taught me that. You learn so much from your athletes when you take the backseat. You decide to say, hey, I'm going to learn from you, and then I'm going to share what information I can to help you. A big lesson I took away was, I came out of grad school. I had all this knowledge. I read all this research. I was ready to just disseminate all the information possible so that there was nothing they would miss. There was nothing they couldn't do to be better. And I feel like a lot of athletes resonate with that.
Yeah.
They want to do everything they
Give
can.
me everything, yeah.
Under the sun, shortcuts as possible. And that was something I was willing to provide. But I realized that wasn't going to help them in the long run. And I was going to get shut out or, misinterpreted by a lot of athletes who didn't have what they needed. And I didn't listen to that. So my last experience at North Carolina, I took an entire, semester to just learn the names and learn who they were, the athletes, on a pure basis. Second semester rolls around. I knew exactly what to say, when to say something, when to not say something. You'd be surprised how much you learn by not trying to teach them stuff and just ask, like, what do you want to learn? What are you interested in? Letting them kind of lead it within a boundary for sure. But I think that was the biggest aha moment for myself, is to really humble myself, see where they're coming from, because they have so much to offer as young adults.
Right. Okay. So contextually within the scope of performance, when you take that role, what were some of the most effective ways that you were able to help the athletes through nutrition and say, like, okay, now I know I've got your situation, or at least I'm doing my best to understand your situation, and here's what I have for you. How were you able to kind of like enhance their performance, on the court, on the field, through those sessions?
Yeah. So a classic, collegiate athlete example is, my performance is going down. I'm getting injured. I'm tired a lot. Here's classic indicators of relative energy deficiency. So relative to the amount of energy they're spending, they're deficient. It's trying to make it simple for them to enhance that performance. So part of it is sitting down with them. For most of me, sitting down with them, going through a schedule, trying to plug in, hey, where can we get quick snacks, quick meals? What's your budget look like? What's your cooking skills like? Let's try and build a meal, a guideline for what you can do. And I'm not just going to slide you a meal plan and say, like, hey, just eat these foods at these times and you're going to be fine. Right. Typically, that's what we think a person like me would do. But by teaching them, hey, here's why we might eat this at this time, right? Nutrient timing. We want to get gas in your tank before you go to practice for 3 hours. Yeah. We want to make sure we're hydrated during these times. Your performance is going to drop significantly. It's the middle of summer. We're in Florida. It's humid. It's going to be rough. So maybe add some salt. So all these little details, when they're ready, we can add in, and it's a lot influenced by that individual. A classic example that anyone can really do is look at their electrolyte intake, right? Electrolytes kind of have this mystique about them, like too much salt, high blood pressure, or like, what about these other electrolytes outside of sodium? And we have methods to test hydration. It's very scientific. Gatorade's dedicate a lot of money to it. I think that's amazing. But for average people, it's not as accessible. Looking at your clothes and looking for salt rings, or if you're a heavy salter, right? So losing lots of electrolytes, that's something I can ask someone. They're like, I've never thought of that. Next practice, they look at their shirt. Now we're trying to find foods high in sodium, because that's something that's going to immediately boost their performance. Very small thing to incorporate into their diet, right? More salt on your food, some soy sauce, some hot sauce. Yeah. These are the little simple tips and tricks that I like to add in. One of my main domains, as a strength coach, you're in the weight room. That's your spot. Yes. My domain is in the dining facility, at the training table, around the snacks. I love talking to people around food, because they hear it, they see it, they do it, and then it makes sense. Yeah. Sitting in a room with them, across the table, kind of quiet, they're reserved, it doesn't work as well. So I
Right.
really love that environment to make it education application.
Yeah, it's literally palatable in that way.
Exactly.
Nice. Okay, awesome. So you've talked about it a little bit, especially with the ways that you think you were saying that people need to, or our programs need to kind of come up to speed. But could you maybe discuss a little bit of how you think that nutrition in sports organizations should improve themselves to facilitate optimal performance, optimal health for their teams?
Yeah. I think it's a consensus thing that we have to decide on. Each university is so diverse based off the resources that we have to take into account the landscape that exists for our athletes, right? And trying to think about what can we standardize, because there are some standardizations within strength and conditioning that everyone follows universally.
Yeah,
it's a given because it's supported by research, and it's been around for a lot longer than sports nutrition has. So we've been able to test it through a lot more series of athletes to say, okay, this is what works, this is what doesn't work, and here's where we're kind of trying to figure things out. In sports nutrition, we're a little bit behind as far as those tactics come in. I think, and this is just brainstorming on what I think might be the next step, is to standardize how we evaluate athletes, to see their needs. Because a lot of the needs we're recognizing right now lie in the realm of things we can do to only increase performance in an acute setting. So your performance in the next 4 years is what I'm concerned with. And maybe an individual's job relies on those 4 years in performance and wins and losses. That's a privilege that I don't have. I mean, that's a privilege that I have, that I don't have to necessarily worry about wins and losses.
Mm-hmm.
But in the context of athletics, performance, and winning, nutrition is seen as the thing that's going to give us the advantage over the other team. So
Right.
Moving away from that narrative, it can still exist, no doubt. I think there's a place, time and place for it, but we have to make sure, I call them human athletes, right? They're human beings first.
Right.
We have to make sure we take care of the human piece first, and then prioritize the athletes second. And that's a huge paradigm shift between what we have in competitive athletics.
Yeah.
I think nutrition should follow a model similar to how other countries, and I mentioned earlier about long-term athlete development. Countries like Canada and some European countries are fantastic. They take the age of the athlete, they take the skills and abilities, and they track it over time, right? You're really building fundamental layers to build life after sport from a physical context. Okay. We should take a similar model and say, okay, here's nutrition growing up, very basic, fundamental food security. Here's a very short time where food has an instrumental purpose, right? And I'm defining instrumental foods as foods that contain nutrients that support a physiological, psychological purpose, whether supported by scientific research or not. Okay. And kind of wrapping around the definition, trying to think of foods that have that that purpose, that functional instrumental purpose. So anti-inflammatories, omega-3s, and certain foods like that, those have instrumental purposes. But kind of moving away from that narrative and thinking about, okay, how can we teach someone how to eat for life? I think that's where nutrition in collegiate sports and sports should start to have a more of a discussion.
Okay. All right. So it needs to include that human component, like you mentioned. So for these athletes, how much of that not being treated like a human and being treated more like a machine to go win, to get that first, second, or third place, how much of, trying to rephrase this, how important do you think the general wellness, that baseline, that stability portion of your nutrition and just general health, how much do you think that contributes to performance? I mean, if you were to because these athletes are, you know, high stress. They, like you said, they're probably under eating. They may even be dehydrated for large portions of their day. How much do you think that just buffing the way that they feel about how they need to be training, do you think that that could translate to performance gains, or do you think that right now performance is so tuned that taking a step back from any of this would cause a performance decrease, though it might increase the general health of that person? I don't know if I phrased that.
Yeah, I think trying to um, interject the health promotion piece when performance is so prominent in someone's life, like in collegiate athletics, it's the right move at the wrong time. I think it needs to be institutionalized from a very young age, and it's asking a lot. It's asking our system from a development standpoint to reconform to a model that it's never really followed, right?
Right.
We're seeing high specialization in youth athletes, right? We're seeing identities formed around being an athlete for a lifelong. And we know in realities, we don't see these things as commonly as they are portrayed within media, right? Within our social groups, right? It's becoming the idea is becoming more accessible to people. And I think it becomes very dangerous when we neglect and we shift the needs from around, right? So if our pyramid is upside down, we put the societal needs above our own personal needs. And it's reinforced. It's reinforced in a lot of our societal structures. I think to say, hey, like health's more important than performance, let's like overlap it and not really think about this piece and just think about health. I think performance would decrease, quite honestly. And we've developed such high performing athletes, like you said, that I hate to use their commodities, but they're machines that people, organizations have, and they're going to invest in those for the purpose of performance.
Right.
So their career after they're gone with the organization, not as accounted for at the same time. An example I see a lot, and I'm not trying to bash on anyone, and it's a new sport, but mixed martial arts, right?
Yeah.
It's transgressed over time, and we see athletes on the back end of the career have to re-identify themselves as far as the way they feel about their body, who they are as a person.
Mm-hmm.
So they teeter in and out of athletics, right? Competing and putting themselves in harm's way in some cases, right? Fighting over the age of 40, fighting for 20 plus years. And while as a society, we commend those things, as a health professional, as I identify myself, I ask myself, is this helping or harming your health? And why are the decisions you're making what decisions you're making? How are they impacting your health and life and longevity, right? Is it contributing to your happiness, or is it going to lead to poor mental health, negative self-identification, negative self-efficacy, things like that? Until you see it on the back end, you don't really think about it in the front end.
Right. So it's some like, are you approaching this after 40 because you just love the sport so much you want to dive back into it, or is it something you feel like you have to prove because your identity, like, for the last 20 years you were a fighter, and it's like, okay, I'm a fighter and that's what I do. Mm-hmm. And then you stop fighting for a while, you retire. So you're saying like helping identify why somebody is doing something, why somebody's jumping back into a sport when it may not actually be a good idea.
Yeah. And you might be wondering, okay, where's the nutrition piece coming in with this? Nutrition is a lifelong thing. So I'm trying to teach people, yes, here's 4 years where I can help increase your performance through these things. But here's a fact of life. Your body will change. The type of exercise you do after you're done competing will change. Those two things are a lot to wrestle with.
Yeah.
Because the way someone sees themselves, the way someone sees other people, and the way their body looks, the way they eat, we as a society has placed such value on the way people eat, what they eat, and how they look, that now it preoccupies an individual's time. And I'm trying to tell them, hey, like these things have very small relevance. And I'm trying to, if they have an impact on your performance, if any, it's in this point. After that point ends, we need to think about all these other things that we're going to have to encounter in the rest of our lives.
Okay. I like it. So, um, we've been talking a lot more about some of like the baseline for the collegiate athletes and the specific populations that you've worked with.
Mhm.
But you mentioned earlier that maybe we can try and extrapolate it out to both the average client or maybe the elite level client. So for the purposes of the interview specifically, the people who are going to be watching this video are chiropractic PhD students, and
Okay.
most of them are going to be going into well, I actually don't know what they're going to be doing specifically, but they're using this general time to start figuring out like what types of populations they want to work with, the types of jobs they're considering. So if you could maybe discuss a little bit about how the needs may differ of an elite athlete to the average athlete, you know, across the spectrum. How you might approach the problem of somebody being completely sedentary to somebody who is training 60 hours a week.
Yeah, I think my main job is nutrition, and I know it's a drop in the bucket for chiropractic students. You're a drop in the bucket of the entire healthcare system that they work in, and we all make up the bucket of the healthcare system. And understanding that we all have a role to play is very powerful, but also understanding that clients have lots of other, whether it be constraints or other obligations or other areas of their health that may have barriers to reaching. Okay. And part of that's realizing that health is multidimensional, right? So if I made their entire health based on their physical abilities, okay? So an athlete, if I said this athlete is high VO2 max, lots of muscle, really lean, high performing, and I only use physical health as the proxy, as the indicator for their health, they're healthy, 100%.
Right.
Okay. As nutrition, if I said, you know, they eat a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, they eat on a consistent basis, their nutrition's perfect, and I define their health only on nutrition, they're perfectly healthy. But there's all these other factors, mental, spiritual, environmental. You can search it up on the internet, 8 dimensions of wellness. We have to account for those types of things and their pursuit of that. Because an athlete, for an example, spends majority of their time focused on physical and nutritional health. Almost exclusively. I find it very rare that an athlete says, you know, my environmental health is deteriorating, so I'm going to go, you know, ride my bike and reduce carbon emissions. A weird example, but that's a component of their wellness. So you have to allocate time for different portions of their life, right? And as a chiropractor, you focus on their physical health, but you very well know that their physical health has an impact on their mental health and their relationships, right? Their financial health. If they can't get up and be functional, how are they going to go to work? How are they going to have financial stability? So you have a very key integral role into all the other aspects of their wellness. But keeping in mind that it's just one portion that supports the other, and the others support your portion too. So trying to take that big perspective into how can we best serve this person with the skills that I have.
Okay. So, I mean, it's kind of goes back to your original point. In what I'm hearing is that it really doesn't differ in scale of it, or it doesn't differ in kind between the average athlete and the elite athlete. It doesn't differ in kind in how you approach them. It just kind of differs in the scale and in some of the other smaller considerations for their general lifestyle. And
Yeah.
you discussed it earlier when you mentioned the cohesiveness. So, okay, cool. So that, I mean, that pretty much comes up to the ends of the questions that I had for the video specifically. And we're already at about 50 minutes, but I'd love to hear any more thoughts that you have that you want to put out. I know that there's so much of this is kind of cursory information, and you could easily talk about this stuff for hours. But
For sure.
yeah, I mean, if there's anything that you want to clarify and toss into the conversation, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So one of the big points I like to make about myself as a healthcare professional and the perspective I have is I'm an intuitive eating non-diet dietitian who practices from the HACE perspective. So in short, what that means is I don't do diets. Weight loss is not something I work with. And I like to celebrate body diversity. And I think health can be pursued at a multitude of body sizes. And that comes with a lot of backlash with saying because of societal context. There's no way I could kind of summarize all of that into something concise. It could be an entire another hour, but I think having that perspective as a healthcare professional, because you see a lot of biases, and specifically looking at weight discrimination here, there's lots of forms of discrimination within healthcare, and it's supported by research. It's either implicit or explicit bias that we have. And we're, as chiropractors, right, physically working with certain patients on a somatic level, right, touching them, we may have biases ourselves that we're not aware of in a societal context. Okay, so an example is a larger bodied individual and coming and approaching to me with nutrition, right? They're like, oh, this guy does nutrition, he's a dietitian, he can help me lose weight, and my health and happiness will improve if my weight goes down. Okay, what I'm going to tell people is kind of contrary to society, might be crazy, and I'm welcome people to question this and challenge me on this, is that their health and happiness may or may not improve. And odds are I don't think it's going to improve if they lose weight. I might tell someone, would you be healthier and happier if you lost 10 pounds, or if you got rid of the negative beliefs about your body and your health? I'd opt for the second. But some people would choose the first because our healthcare system is centered around weight.
Yeah.
It's weight centered because we use the BMI still. We weigh people when there's really no implications to health as a measure of, as weight as a measure of health. So we use all these tools to discriminate certain individuals based on their size when it has no relevance to health. And I bring this up because I'm so passionate about it. And I have the privilege to pursue this type of perspective. And I encourage PhD chiropractic students to look into this, because it'll help you identify biases as a practitioner. And if you're interested and passionate about inclusivity within your patients and access to healthcare, right, and trying to reduce discrimination or eliminate it, hopefully, within our healthcare system, this is a great perspective to take and practice with.
Okay, awesome. I actually wanted to have you elaborate a little bit more on one point that you mentioned during that. It's really interesting that you mentioned that the large body bias is sort of implicit in our healthcare system. Like we've just always believed, or in the healthcare system, we've always known that being larger or being fatter is detrimental to your health. And there's studies, even when you look at the naming of the actual papers themselves, it's almost as if they went into it knowing that somebody with a larger body already has negative health risk factors. So they're approaching the research from like, how do we prove that this larger body person is more unhealthy than someone who's in a smaller body?
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit more about some of the biases there and how we might be able to approach it?
Yeah, biases in research really guides where a lot of our funding goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially in some outpatient clinics, or what my job description might even be. And that really reinforces the idea that thin bodies are better bodies. If you trace this ideology up the chain, the BMI, which is, I think as health practitioners, we kind of ruled it out for different reasons, right? I was told in school, like, BMI doesn't account for muscle, and that's why it's not good. But we still use it for health insurance. We still use it on our charting when it probably isn't as relevant. BMI was developed a long time ago by an astronomer and a statistician. So has no idea relative to what constitutes health, right? He was trying to see if there was trends within body size of the heteronormative white community that he lived in, and to try and extrapolate that and say, this is a tool we'll use for diverse ethnic people who we know are in larger bodies just based off genetics. They're already at a disadvantage for being that ethnicity, right? So immediately discriminatory to use that tool. I think in our education too, we have some small portions about weight and nutrition, right? And try and make it simplistic. I thought nutrition for a very long time was physiology and math, right? If I can do calories in, calories out, and I know how nutrient metabolism works, I can manipulate the body. Turns out there's a lot more to it. The behavioral component's very huge and largely influenced by our society. The media that we consume has a large influence on what the ideal body type looks like. And I challenge people to think about their communities that they grew up in and think about, do the stereotypes I hold about larger body or fat people, do they hold true, right? What biases, what do I think about fat people? Are they right, stereotypically lazy? Are they unmotivated? Are they unhealthy? Holding these stigmas against them, we impose that on them.
Yep.
And that affects their health, whether believe it or not. That attitude can be very harmful to the healthcare that we provide to them.
Okay. Nice. Thanks for talking about that. Yeah, it's so multidimensional, and I like that you mentioned the social media aspect and your community aspect, because it really, like, I mean, that's where all of our biases come from, is what we grew up with. So, yeah, definitely interesting. Do you have any other final comments, maybe about like maybe more about I don't know, some of the techniques that you use, or maybe some resources that I could refer some of the students to?
Yeah, I'm happy to provide you with podcasts, books, whatever types of medias you like to use. There's some fantastic social workers out there, dietitians, physicians who have different perspectives within the system on similar things that I've been talking about. And I think getting it from different perspectives allows you to integrate yourself with it, immerse yourself in it, and be able to interact with different types of professionals. Because I think at your stage of education, really refining like, how do I work with other people is going to be a big trademark of maybe sometimes getting hired at a place or not, or being successful with a client or not. So I'll send you actually some books, some podcasts that I really think are more articulately put together than my message sometimes. And there's lots of resources out there, almost too much, but I would start there, and I'm happy to provide my contact information via email. I've got lots of time to respond to them. So if anyone wants to reach out and have a conversation, I'm happy to call on the phone, FaceTime, or anything like that. Please feel free to reach out. And if you're interested in learning more, I'm happy to have that conversation with you.
Okay. All right, Davin. Yeah, I'll let you go for now, but we'll continue the conversation later on. So
cool. Appreciate it, Cole. Good talking to you, man.
Good talking to you. See ya.
Take care.